Of self, I walk in the afternoons, sometimes just to the corner, sometimes farther down to the little pond past the schoolyard where ducks drift without concern. I sit on the bench, the one with a crack running along the wood, and I let the world pass by. I don't wave unless someone waves first. I'm not invisible, I just no longer feel the need to perform my presence. There are neighbors who know my name, who greet me kindly. We don't need long conversations, there's peace in small gestures. The man who owns the bakery always slips me a croissant that's just a bit too brown for the display case. I take it, thank him, and leave a few coins in the dish by the register. There's no story, no expectation, just quiet understanding. I still go to the writing group on Thursdays. We've grown close in our own way. We don't talk much about family. Most of us have stories that run deeper than what's polite to share over tea and ballpoint pens, but we write, and in our writing, we understand each other more than words would ever allow aloud. My home stays clean, not pristine. I let dishes sit in the sink sometimes. I light candles even when there's no guest coming. I've started using the good towels, the ones I once saved for company that never stayed long. I wear the soft cardigan with the frayed cuffs, the one Robert gave me in 1987 after I caught a cold working the bake sale. It still smells faintly of cedar. David calls more regularly now. Our conversations are shorter, gentler. He tells me about work, about his daughter's classes. He doesn't ask for favors anymore. Sometimes he just wants to hear my voice, and I let him. I no longer need to fill every pause. Sometimes the quiet between us says more than anything we could try to explain. Sarah visited last month. She brought tea, not flowers. We sat in the back garden. She looked around, noticed the new trellis I built myself, the tomatoes climbing their way toward sunlight. She didn't say much, but she stayed a while, long enough to finish her cup, long enough to ask how I was doing and listen to the answer. She's trying. I can see it in the way her hands twist in her lap, the way her eyes linger when I speak. She's not the same woman who showed up with the retirement brochure. And I'm not the same mother who would have quietly folded myself into the life they designed for me. We're learning how to meet again, not as roles, but as people. There are still moments of sadness, sometimes when I hear a child's laughter from the park across the street. I feel a tug, a flicker of what was, of the years when this house echoed with the stampede of small feet and high voices. Sometimes I open drawers and find notes scribbled in crayons, or grocery lists written in Robert's blocky script, and the ache returns, like a low tide. But the ache no longer owns me. It visits, and then it leaves, and in its place, I find a calm that comes from knowing I have nothing left to prove, no one left to impress. Just a life I tend to carefully, like the plants in my windowsill watered, turned toward light, and left alone enough to grow. I've started writing small essays, nothing grand, just reflections. About aging, about presence, about the ways we shape our lives around people who sometimes forget to see us. I don't write to be published. I write to remember, to place my life in my own words. Last week, I sat on the porch as dusk fell, the breeze warm and filled with the scent of honeysuckle. A young couple walked by, hand in hand, quiet in their own way. The girl looked up, smiled at me, and said, "Your roses are beautiful." I nodded, returned the smile, and said thank you. She didn't know the story behind those roses, didn't need to. All she saw was what was still blooming, and that, I think, is enough. I am not waiting anymore, not for apologies, not for recognition, not even for time to return what it took. I've lived, I've loved it. I've been forgotten and remembered and forgotten again, but I remain, not angry, just empty of expectation, and that emptiness, it feels like peace. The seasons have turned again. The rose petals that once unfurled so boldly along the gardens edge have begun to fall in gentle spirals, collecting along the path like faded confetti. It's October now, and the air smells of cinnamon and wind. I like this time of year. There's something honest about it, how the trees let go, how the light changes without asking permission. I understand that kind of shift now. My days are still simple, mornings with tea, afternoons with books or writing or walking. But they no longer feel like routines born from loneliness. They feel like a rhythm I chose. I no longer wait for holidays to feel meaningful, or for phone calls to anchor my week. The meaning I've found lives in the quiet itself. I keep the house just warm enough. I bake a loaf of bread every Sunday, not because anyone's coming over, but because I like how the scent fills the rooms, clings to the drapes, and settles into the floorboards like comfort. I've made peace with the furniture creaks, the uneven drawer in the hallway, the porch step that always gives a little underfoot. These imperfections used to feel like chores, now they feel like characters, like company. I've started lighting a candle in the evening, just one, by the window. I don't know why, really. Maybe it's for Robert. Maybe it's for the part of myself that waited in that kitchen, heart cracking, as the people I raised unwrapped their takeout like I wasn't standing there with love on every plate. Or maybe it's just a small gesture to remind the world and myself that I'm still here. Sometimes the kids visit, not often. But when they do, it's different now. They come softly, they ask first. They notice things, the color of the curtains, the new quilt I made, the bowl of apples on the counter. David brought a pie last week, store-bought, but warm. He said it reminded him of the ones I used to make. I smiled and said nothing, but I cut to slices and served them on the blue china, the ones we hadn't used in years. Sarah came by not long after. She stayed longer than usual. She didn't bring anything but herself, and for once that felt like enough. We walked through the garden, and she reached down, touching the rose bush. Still blooming, she whispered. I didn't tell her about the letter buried underneath. Some things are better held close. She's different now, not entirely, but softened. She asks about my writing, about the things I've been reading. She even sat beside me during one of my Thursday writing group meetings, not to participate, just to listen. She said afterward that she never realized how full silence could be until she saw people sitting in it, together, with purpose. I think that was her way of understanding what I had been trying to show her all along. It's not a perfect ending. There are still spaces between us, but those spaces don't ache the way they used to. They just exist, like rooms you walk through without needing to rearrange. I received a letter last week, not from my children, from my granddaughter, Lily, handwritten, in careful print. She's 14 now, Grandma, she wrote. I think I understand a little more now. Dad said you taught him about making a home, not just having one. I think that's what you've given me, too, even when I wasn't paying attention. She drew a tiny heart at the bottom, no glitter, no stickers, just paper and ink and time. That letter sits on my writing desk now, under a smooth stone I picked up from the coast years ago. I don't need to reread it to know what it says. I just like seeing it there. Proof that even the softest parts of us leave traces. I often think about that Christmas Eve now, not with bitterness, but with a kind of stillness. I see myself standing in that kitchen, apron tied, table set, heart full, and I realize I wasn't wrong to hope. I wasn't wrong to give. I just didn't know that giving without being seen was a slow kind of erosion, one you don't notice until you've nearly disappeared. But I'm not gone. Not folded away. Not packed into the edges of someone else's story. I still live here, in the house that holds my footsteps, in the garden that keeps growing, whether or not someone stands in it, in the letters I write, in the meals I make just for me, in the chair by the window where the light falls in the late Afternoon like an old friend, and the truth is, I don't need redemption. I just needed space, to speak, to be quiet, to let go, to come home to myself. The world may not notice when a woman stops chasing what she's already given 100 times, but she notices. Her hands rest easier, her breath deepens, her shoulders no longer carry what isn't hers. This house still holds me, and that holding, that staying, is not a sign of being left behind. It's a sign of knowing where you belong. And at the end of all things, after the takeout, after the silence, after the long winter of being unseen that knowing is everything, I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. They'd see me, but somewhere along the way, my giving became their default. And when I stopped, when I finally asked them to come home for Christmas and told them I'd cook it, was as though they heard street. Attic, not a request, not an invitation. Just noise. That's the hardest part, really. Not the exhaustion, or even the rejection. It's the realization that what you gave them all those years, your time, your softness, your steadiness, never imprinted. It was expected, absorbed, forgotten, like breathing in a mirror, gone as soon as it appeared. I used to think that love was a light you kept lit, no matter how dark it got around you. But now I think maybe it's a match meant to be struck, seen and tended, and if no one shelters it, no one notices the warmth, it burns out, and then you're left with the smoke. The painful things aren't always sharp. Sometimes they're soft and weightless, like falling leaves. And you don't even notice how deep they've piled up around your feet until you're standing in a quiet season of sorrow with no clear path back. That's how it was for me. There was no big blowout, no shouting match or dramatic goodbye, just a slow shift, a drift, 100 small slights that left no scars, only silence. It began with the phone calls. At first, they came often, short ones, busy ones, but still, I'd hear David's voice on Tuesdays, usually in the car during his commute. He'd talk about work, traffic, the price of gas. I listened more than I spoke. I got used to the sound of his blinker cutting in and out, his voice fading as he switched between towers. Then the calls started coming every other week, then once a month. Then not at all unless I called first. When I stopped initiating them, I wondered how long it would take for them to notice. 3 weeks passed, then 6, and when I finally heard from him again, it was because his daughter needed a recommendation for a summer internship, and he thought I might know someone in town. He didn't ask how I'd been. Sarah was more unpredictable. She would go months without contact, then call at midnight as though we'd just spoken the day before. Her voice always came fast, frantic, like she was trying to get it all out before changing her mind, but even her apologies started sounding routine. Sorry, Mom, things have been nuts. Just so swamped. You know how it is. But I didn't, not really. My days were quiet, structured, uncomplicated. There were no schedules so packed I couldn't make space for someone I loved. I just stopped being someone they made space for, and then there were the birthdays. I used to send handwritten cards, little gifts I thought they'd find useful. For David, a book on train history, a nice pair of gloves. For Sarah, herbal teas she liked, a framed photo of us from years ago. I took time wrapping them, thought about the color of the ribbon, but one year neither of them called on my birthday, not even a text. I remember sitting on the porch that day with a cup of tea that had gone cold. It was raining lightly, and the sound of it in the gutters reminded me of childhood, of waiting for Robert to come home with the Sunday paper and a bear claw from the bakery. But there were no surprises that day. Just the realization that my birthday had become something remembered only by junk mail and the pharmacy. Later, Sarah told me she thought David had reached out, and David assumed Sarah had. I nodded. I didn't remind them it had been 2 years since I'd had them both under the same roof. Even when they visited, they didn't really see me. They'd sit in the living room, scrolling their phones, asking half-listening questions. How's the garden? Still volunteering at the library? Are you still making that soup we like? But their eyes never stayed long. Always looking past me, waiting for the next ding of a notification, the next call, once. Sarah came with a friend and spent the whole afternoon talking about a wellness retreat she'd attended. They docked her. Ank sparkling water out of cans and barely touched the tray of lemon bars I'd made, the same recipe their grandmother used to bake, the one Sarah begged for when she was little. At the end of the visit, she told me I should get out more. I didn't ask her where or with whom, and there were other little things too many to count, like when they started correcting me, gently at first, like brushing lint from my sleeve. No, Mom. You said that wrong, or that's not how it happened, as if memory itself had become a thing I couldn't be trusted with. I noticed it most when I spoke about Robert. They'd cut me off, reinterpret events, joke about how I romanticized the past, but I hadn't forgotten. I remembered the smell of his flannel shirts, the way he rubbed the bridge of his nose when thinking, the quiet whistle under his breath when he read the paper. I remembered things they didn't even know to notice, and yet they spoke like curators of a history I had lived. Even my home, my sanctuary, was no longer mine in their eyes. When they visited, they'd open cabinets without asking, rearrange things and tell me what I should do with the space. Sarah once brought over a box of updates, new dish towels, a sleek toaster, some wall art she thought I'd like, but I missed my old things. The sunflower tea kettle Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary, the clock in the hallway that ticked a little too loudly, the chipped porcelain figurine on the mantel that had belonged to my mother. Those things weren't modern, they weren't sleek, but they were mine. I began to feel like a guest in my own life, and the loneliness didn't announce itself. It crept in slowly, folding itself into the rhythm of my days. I still went on my walks, still tended to my roses, still made dinner, even if it was just soup and toast, but the silence became heavier. It sat beside me at the table, followed me into the bedroom, lay down beside me at night, and though I had friends, neighbors, people from church, none of them could fill the space shaped exactly like the people I'd once held in my arms. It wasn't bitter, not then, just something like erosion. And I started to wonder, had I raised them to become the very people who could forget me? Or had they become that despite me? One day, I found a note tucked in an old book. Sarah had written it in high school. It said, "Mom, thank you for always being there. I want to be just like you when I'm older." I held that piece of paper like a prayer, but even prayers sometimes get lost in the noise. I didn't expect them to need me the way they once did, but I hoped I might still matter, that my presence might still feel like comfort, like home, instead. I had become background music, familiar, fading, and easy to ignore, and when I really looked back, I could see it clearly. They hadn't stopped loving me, they had just stopped remembering how. The day they sold the house without telling me was the day everything turned. I had lived there for 47 years. That white brick bungalow on Pine Hollow Road wasn't just where I raised my children, it was where I became a person. I had planted every bush along the fence line with my own hands. I'd painted the hallway a dozen times over the years, trying to find the right shade of yellow that felt like morning sunlight. That house held the weight of my life, Robert's laughter, the creak of the hallway at night, the scent of cinnamon on Saturdays. Even the floorboards knew me. They groaned differently under my feet than anyone else's, and in the end, none of that mattered. It was early spring when it happened. The tulips were just beginning to push their green blades through the ford soil, and I'd just finished trimming back the roses when Sarah pulled into the drive, her tires crunching lightly over the gravel. She came alone, no advance call, no warning. I remember she walked in quickly, with the kind of energy people carry when they've already rehearsed their lines. She said it like she was delivering good news. "Mom, we've found you a place. It's quiet, it's got good light, and a view of the lake." I didn't understand what she meant at first. I thought maybe she'd found a new walking trail or a cafe, something to share, but then she pulled out the brochure, folded, glossy, impersonal, Whispering Pines Retirement Residences. It said in cursive lettering that reminded me of wedding invitations. Beneath it, a photo of a wide-poached building with rows of identical chairs, empty ones. Still, I waited. I waited for her to say it was optional, a thought, a suggestion. I waited for the part where she'd ask me how I felt, but that part never came. "We signed the papers already," she said. "The house has been listed. It'll close in 3 weeks." I stared at her. At her polished nails and tidy hair and the soft, almost apologetic smile she wore like a mask. I remember the sound of the clock behind me tick, 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 like it was trying to measure my disbelief. I asked her who had signed the paperwork. She said David had power of attorney. "You signed the document after Dad passed," she reminded me. "Remember, you said it would just be for emergencies." Yes, I remembered. I remembered the night Robert died. When my hands couldn't stop shaking and the world felt like it was sliding out from under me, I remembered David placing the papers in front of me, gently, telling me it was just in case something happened to me too. I stopped waiting for them to look back, and in that stillness I began to feel something I hadn't in years, whole. There's something about reclaiming your own voice after years of being spoken over. It doesn't arrive with fanfare, it arrives like morning light, inching slowly through the blinds, touching each corner of the room until you realize the darkness is gone. That was what the days felt like after I kept the house. Quiet, steady, and suddenly mine again. I began to move differently, not out of vengeance, not to prove anything, but because I realized I had a choice to keep being reduced to someone else's version of elderly, or to start living as a woman still capable of shaping her own life. So I shifted, softly. Deliberately, no announcements, just action. I cancelled the cable service I never watched, sold the old car that Robert used to drive, and bought myself a small hybrid blue, compact, easy to handle. The salesman tried to talk to me like I was confused, but I corrected him gently, firmly. I knew what I wanted, and when I drove it home, the silence in the car felt like freedom. Just me, the road, and the soft hum of the engine. Next, I cleared out the guest rooms, not with sadness, but with purpose. I folded the sheets with care, boxed up the old toys and mismatched towels, and donated them to the shelter in town. There was no point keeping them for people who only visited when it was convenient. The rooms didn't need to sit frozen in a time when I still hoped they'd come back and stay. I made space, literal, physical space for things that brought me peace. One of the rooms I turned into a sewing nook again. I hadn't sewn in years, not since arthritis slowed my fingers, but I found that with patience, with soft music and good light, I could still stitch, still created. I bought some linen, some thick cotton, and started making simple things: napkins, tote bags, even a few aprons. Nothing fancy, but every stitch felt like a thread pulling me back into myself. The other room I turned into a small library. I painted the walls a shade called tea leaf, warm, muted, comforting. I moved the books from the hallway shelves, sorted them by feeling, not genre, the ones that made me cry, the ones that made me feel less alone. The ones I read to Sarah and David when they were children, even if they didn't remember. And then I started going out again, not far, not loud, but I returned to places I used to love: the farmers' market on Saturdays, the tiny cafe down on Waverley that still made real hot chocolate. I took long walks in the cemetery, not because it was morbid, but because it was peaceful. The names on the stones were company in their own way, quiet witnesses to time and memory. No one interrupted me there, no one asked me to justify the way I spent my days. I began to speak to people again, but not to fill the air. I spoke with intention. The woman at the flower stand who always tied my bouquet with twine. The librarian who noticed I preferred books with quiet endings. The older gentleman who sat on the park bench feeding the birds, never in a rush. We didn't need to speak much. We just nodded, smiled. There's a certain language between people who've lived through enough seasons to understand that silence is not always empty. One afternoon, I joined a writing group. They met once a week in the back room of the community centre, 6 of us in total, all over 60. We didn't read aloud unless we wanted to. We just wrote about childhood, memory, grief, food, rain. Whatever surfaced, I started writing about the house, not as a setting, but as a character, the walls that held my secrets, the windows that knew my quiet watching, the garden that grew with me and then outgrew me. Putting it into words gave it a shape I could hold, and slowly, I stopped waiting for their calls. When David phoned now, it was out of rhythm. I could hear it in his voice, the awkward pause before he asked how I was, the forced cheer in his tone. Sarah left voicemail sometimes, just checking in. Mom, I didn't return everyone. Sometimes I listened and let them drift into the archive of things I no longer chased. I wasn't cruel. I was simply, still, I had spent so many years revolving around them, tethered by invisible threads of guilt and expectation. But now I moved. Differently, I moved around myself, around my own rhythms. I took naps when I wanted, ate dinner at 4, or not at all. I kept fresh flowers on the kitchen counter, even if I was the only one who saw them. They say independence is loud marches, declarations, great leaps of change, but mine was quiet, like water seeping back into the earth after the storm. It didn't need to be seen to be real. One morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside, a single photo, an old one of David and Sarah, maybe 5 and 8 years old, sitting on the back steps with popsicles dripping down their arms. I hadn't seen it in years. On the back, written in faint pencil, were the words, "We were happy." Once, I didn't recognize the handwriting. Maybe Sarah found it in one of the boxes and sent it without saying. Maybe David, or maybe someone else entirely. I placed it on the mantel, not out of longing, but as a quiet truth. We had been happy once, and that was enough. I no longer tried to rebuild what was gone. Instead, I tended to what remained. I made peace with my solitude, dressed it in soft sweaters and chamomile tea. I let the days come without rushing them, let the evenings settle like dust on old pages. There was no grand reinvention, just the slow, steady return to myself, and in that return, I discovered something they never gave me: dignity. It took them a while to notice I was gone in the ways that mattered. Not physically, my house was still where it had always been. The porch light still came on at dusk. The hydrangeas still bloomed along the front walk, but I was no longer their safety net. I had pulled back the quiet labor of love that once wrapped around their lives like an invisible thread, and the unraveling didn't happen all at once. It came slowly, like the soft loosening of stitches. I heard about it first from the woman who runs the church pantry. She mentioned that Sarah had come in, looking pale, rushed, asking about donations for a charity gala she was chairing. She didn't stay long. The woman said gently, seemed tired, overwhelmed. I nodded and said nothing, but I knew that I was tired, knew the weight of trying to hold too many things when you've cut off the hands that used to steady you. Later that month, a neighbor from 2 streets over stopped me near the post office and said David had come by asking about lawn services. Said the grass at his place had grown wild. that his daughter had allergies, and no one had remembered to trim it down in time. He used to ask me, not directly, but he'd call. Voice full of something unspoken, and I'd show up the next morning with clippers and gloves, pretending I'd just happened to be in the area. I never made him ask, but I was done pretending now. They had grown used to me cushioning their lives in quiet ways, watching the kids when meetings ran long, sending meals when the flu hits the house, remembering anniversaries, mailing cards with handwritten notes that always made it seem like I had endless time to think of them. They had accepted those things like sunrise, assumed they'd always be there. Now, the silence pressed differently on them. Sarah sent a bouquet on my birthday that year, expensive, prearranged, the kind with glitter sprayed on the petals and a generic card that said "Love you always." I placed it on the kitchen table. Not out of sentiment, but as a kind of monument, a reminder of what had changed, what money couldn't restore. David came by once in June, stood on the porch, holding a small plant in a decorative pot. "Thought you might like it," he said. I took it, thanked him. We sat in the front yard for a while, the silence stretching between us like old rope. He didn't ask to come in, I didn't offer. He mentioned work, the market, the stress of it all. I nodded. He asked if I was doing okay. I said I was. We both knew that was true. I could feel his discomfort, not because I'd been cruel, but because I no longer bent myself around his convenience, the absence of my usual warmth. Unsettled. He'd never realized how much of me he'd come to expect, and how quiet the world became without my voice smoothing over the hard parts. When Sarah called next, her voice cracked halfway through. She told me she'd missed our talks, said she hadn't realized how much they helped her make sense of things. She didn't say sorry. Not directly, but it was there, folded in between. The sentences like dried lavender pressed in a forgotten book, faint but still fragrant. I didn't say I missed her too. I didn't rush to fill the gap with comfort. I let the silence stand, and for once she stayed with it, didn't hang up, didn't shift the conversation. She stayed. That in itself was something. I'd started to see how much of my old identity had been tied to their needs, how I'd let myself be whittled down into roles, caretaker, peacekeeper, provider, but none of those roles ever asked what I needed in return. And now that they were gone, now that I had stepped out of that old mold, I could see them struggling. Without the structure I used to quietly offer, there were no more Sunday check-ins from me, no more reminders about flu shots or car inspections. No more baking done in advance for birthdays, no more calendars marked with their commitments. I wasn't there to carry the weight anymore, and they felt it. Even the grandchildren noticed. Sarah's youngest sent me a drawing in the mailer. Crooked house with flowers out front and the words "Grandma's Quiet Garden" scrawled in the corner. No one prompted her, I'm sure. It came folded in half, tucked inside an envelope with a return address in the corner I'd memorized years ago. I put it on the fridge next to an old magnet from our first family trip to Maine. Children know. They may not understand the complexity, but they feel the absence of care. One afternoon, I passed by a family at the park, mother, father, child. The father knelt to tie the little boy's shoe while the mother adjusted his cap. The child beamed, holding both their hands, and I felt it, a soft ache in my chest. No regret, not longing, just the quiet truth of having once been the center of a world that no longer existed. And yet I didn't want it back. Not like it was. What I wanted was recognition. And what I gave them now was space to see what happened in my absence, to understand what it meant to lose someone who had always been there. It wasn't revenge, it was reality. And reality, when it lands, has a weight no performance can carry. They began to reach out more thoughtfully, short notes, small gestures. Sarah offered to take me to lunch one day, Just the two of us. I said yes, but didn't rearrange my schedule to suit her. When she arrived late, I didn't chide her. I simply ordered for myself and sipped my tea. She sat across from me, breathless, apologetic. I listened, that was enough. David invited me to his daughter's school play. I declined, not out of spite, but because it was okay to say no. I no longer showed up simply because I'd always done so. My presence had meaning now, it came with choice. And I saw, slowly, how that choice changed the tone of everything. They began to speak to me not as a fixture, but as a person, a woman with her own days, her own silence, her own soul. What they lost without me wasn't just convenience, it was the quiet rhythm of being cared for. Without asking. The comfort of knowing someone was always watching the edges of their lives, gently tucking in the corners, and what I found without them was a clarity I hadn't known I needed. Sometimes. The absence of what we once gave is the only way others learn to see it. And in that space, both of us began, slowly, to grow again. It was a quiet Sunday when I wrote the letter. The rain had started in the early hours, not hard, but steady, one of those spring rains that seems to ask nothing of you, but still soaks the earth through. I had spent the morning reading in my chair by the window, a blanket tucked around my knees, a cup of tea cooling beside me. The book was good, though I can't recall the title now. But it was the silence, not the story, that lingered, and the sound of the rain tapping the roof like a memory returning. That's when I took out the writing pad. It was the same one I'd used for years, ivory pages with faint blue lines, the corners slightly curled from time. I'd always kept it in the drawer by the pantry, along with my stamps and a few envelopes with floral linings. I hadn't written a real letter in a long time, not since Robert. Emails and texts had replaced the slow, thoughtful rhythm of pen on paper. But that day, I didn't want speed. I wanted to gain weight. I wanted ink that sank into the page like truth. I didn't know who the letter was for when I began. At first, it felt like I was writing to no one, or maybe to everyone. I started with a simple line, "I remember the day you stopped seeing me." And from there, the words spilled out not in anger, not in grief, but in clarity. I wrote about the dinner I cooked, the one they ignored. I described the way the ham had crackled in the oven, the glaze, the green beans. The way the buttered rolls had filled the house with warmth. I wrote about the silence when they placed takeout on my table. How their laughter didn't break the quiet, it deepened it. I wrote about standing in my kitchen, apron still tied, hands trembling not with rage, but with the sharp awareness that I no longer mattered in the way I once had. I didn't name them. Not David, not Sarah. I didn't have to. The letter wasn't about blame. It was about release. I wrote about the years I gave without question, about birthdays remembered, illnesses nursed, tears held, sacrifices made, about the mornings I rose before sunrise to pack lunches, the nights I stayed up late sewing costumes, baking cakes, holding space. I wrote about how it all began to slip away, not in a flood, but like water through cupped hands. I gave you a place to return to. I wrote, and over time, you forgot it was mine. My pen didn't shake, my hand didn't falter. The words felt sure, even as they made my throat tighten. I wrote about the betrayal not just of selling the house, but of assuming I was ready to be folded away, tucked into a life of soft rooms and scheduled meals, far from the walls that had known my deepest joys and hardest nights. I wrote about what it meant to be erased gently, and how much quieter that kind of disappearance feels. But I also wrote about what came after, about the way the house felt when I walked it alone, not empty, but returned. I wrote about the tulips blooming without needing witnesses, about finding my own name in the corners of the days again, about how silence, once it stopped aching, became a kind of music. I wrote about Mr. Caldwell, the lawyer, and how his eyes didn't look past me when I spoke about painting the library walls tea leaf green, about the sewing machine humming in the room that used to wait for guests who never stayed long enough. And then I wrote to the girl I had once been. "I'm sorry I let them dim you," I wrote. "You deserved to be seen, not just needed." It was the most painful part, writing to the version of myself that once believed unconditional love meant limitless sacrifice, that to be good was to be tireless. That to be needed was the same as being cherished. I wrote about how wrong I had been. And then I forgave myself. The letter wasn't long for pages, folded neatly. I didn't sign it. I didn't date it. I placed it inside an envelope without an address and walked it out to the garden. The rain had let up by then, the sky shifting from grey to something warmer, as if it, too, was softening. I buried the envelope beneath the rose bush, the one that Robert planted after Sarah was born. Its blooms were just beginning to bud again. I didn't cry, but I stood there a long time, my hands in the damp soil, my breath steady. It felt like I had finally said something I'd been holding for years. And the ground received it, quietly, fully. That afternoon, I baked bread, not for anyone else, just for myself. I ate it warm with butter, the kind that melts quickly and tastes like memory. I sat by the window, the same chair as before, and watched the rain return in gentle waves. A few days later, I found a letter in my own mailbox. It was from Sarah. Her handwriting was hesitant, looped differently than before. Inside was a single page. "I don't know how to say sorry in a way that reaches the depth of what I feel, but I'm trying to understand. I think I see more now. I hope it's not too late to become someone better." I placed it beside the drawing from her daughter on the fridge, not as proof, not as permission, but as a possibility. That letter I wrote, it wasn't meant to change anyone else, but it changed me. It pulled my truth into the open, gave it shape, and once something has shape, it can no longer haunt you in formless ways. It just lives there, with you, and you move forward. Lighter, knowing what you gave, and knowing what you'll no longer give away. My days are slow now, not empty, not idle, just quiet in the way old wood is quiet. Settled. I wake before the sun most mornings. I don't set an alarm. My body simply knows the rhythm of first light brushing the curtains. I lie still for a while, listening to the creaks of the house, the distant hum of the world beginning again. Sometimes that stillness is the best part of my day. I get up, wrap myself in my robe, and pad down the hallway barefoot. The kitchen greets me with its usual softness, sunlight catching the dust in the air. The kettle waiting. I boil water for tea, sometimes coffee, depending on my mood. The old radio still works, crackling gently if I turn the volume to high, so I keep it low, just enough to hear a familiar voice between the silence. I eat breakfast at the table. Sometimes toast with honey, sometimes just fruit. I no longer rush. I no longer measure my day by who might call or visit. I gave that up like a worn coat, something that used to keep me warm, but had become too heavy to wear. Outside, the garden is in full bloom. The rose bush, the one that holds my letter beneath it, is blooming early this year. Deep red petals with golden centers, fragrant and bold. I tend to do it with reverence, not for what it means to others, but for what it returned to me. A sense of stewardship, of place. That it was for safety, for simplicity, that it didn't mean anything would change. I had trusted him, trusted that he would protect me the way I had protected them. Trusted that he'd honor what mattered, but he hadn't, they saw the house as a problem, as maintenance, equity, burden. They saw me as fragile, though I was the one still sweeping the front porch every morning, still baking bread on Sundays, still keeping the place together while they lived their busy, faraway lives. They thought I needed managing. I could see it in Sarah's eyes, that blend of concern and control, the way people talk to you once they've decided they know what's best for you. She spoke like I was a child again. like I couldn't understand what was being done to me. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just stood there, looking down at the kitchen table where Robert used to read the paper, where my children once spilled juice boxes and coloured outside the lines. That table was older than Sarah's marriage. They had already packed up my things. I found out later that the boxes in the garage neatly labelled kitchen linen memorabilia were packed by a moving company the week before. They'd gone through my drawers, my closet, touched my clothes, my journals, my photographs, strangers, not even family, when I walked into the bedroom later that day. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed had been emptied, my wedding dress, the baby clothes I'd kept, the letters Robert wrote me from the train yard during the winter strike. All gone, packed by hands that didn't know their weight. And the worst part, David didn't even come to tell me in person. He left it to Sarah, said he couldn't get away from work. Said he trusted Sarah to handle it, like I was a task, like I was an old appliance being replaced. They said the new place had activities and meal plans and friendly staff, but I didn't want bingo nights or lukewarm casseroles. I wanted my garden. I wanted the creaky stair rail Robert tightened every spring. I wanted the sound of my wind chimes after a summer storm. They didn't ask what I wanted. They assumed, decided, acted. I sat in the living room that night after Sarah had gone and stared at the empty spot where the family photo used to hang. My eyes landed on the nail still sticking out of the wall. Tiny, rusted, faithful, that nail had held so many frames, weddings, school pictures, anniversaries, and now it held nothing. I stayed up until morning, watched the sunrise through the kitchen window, the same way I had for nearly half a century. I drank my coffee slowly, without cream, and I thought about what it meant to be unchosen, not in anger, but in finality. That was the line, the one they couldn't uncross, not the takeout, not the forgotten birthdays, not even the growing distance. It was that moment when they traded my home for convenience, and my voice for permission they never sought. That was the day I stopped pretending I was still theirs. There was no confrontation. No slammed door, no letter left on the table. Just a quiet switch inside me, flipped in the softest way, the way a candle goes out when the air shifts. After Sarah left that day, after the glossy brochure and the cheerful bullet points and the news that my home had already been taken from beneath me, I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I simply stopped speaking the language they understood. I went silent. At first, they thought it was compliance. They mistook my stillness for agreement. The way people do when they don't look closely enough. David texted that night something like, "Glad you're taking this well, Mom, you'll love it there." I didn't reply. I let the message sit unopened, unread, like a stone at the bottom of a well. I started moving differently in the house, almost like a guest preparing for departure. But not in the way they expected. I didn't begin packing. I didn't mark boxes or call the movers. I made lists instead, long, quiet ones in the margins of an old notebook I kept tucked in the drawer by the phone. Not lists of items, but of memories, what had happened in each room, the smell of Christmas mornings, the warmth of Robert's hand resting on the small of my back in the kitchen when no one was looking, the place on the floor where Sarah took her first steps. These weren't things they could pack into cardboard. These were mine. They always had been. I didn't ask questions. I didn't call to beg them to reconsider. I let their silence meet mine, and in that void I began to see things more clearly. Without their voices filling the space, I could finally hear my own thoughts again. In the quiet, I remembered who I was before motherhood consumed every corner of me. There had been dreams once. I had wanted to open a small shop, homemade jams, hand-stitched aprons, maybe even some second-hand books. I used to sketch it on napkins while waiting for dinner to finish baking. I'd forgotten about that version of myself, the one who used to hum while sewing late into the night. who made blackberry preserves in July and gave them to neighbours in glass jars with handwritten lab. Els, the silence gave me permission to revisit her. I went through my documents, slowly and carefully, found my copy of the will, my birth certificate, the deed I had shared with Robert. I called the county office one morning while the house was still wrapped in birdsong and mist, and asked quiet questions, not about stopping the sail that ship had sailed, but about what I still owned, what control I still had, and I learned something they hadn't counted on, though David had power of attorney. It was limited. It had never been updated after Robert's death, never formalized beyond what we had signed in a moment of grief. It gave him temporary authority in case of a medical emergency, not the right to sell the house. Not without my signed consent. They hadn't closed on it yet. They had listed it, moved fast, but they had made assumptions. And in their rush to handle me, to manage me like an aging file that needed closing, they had skipped the part where my name still meant something. I didn't call them, I called a lawyer. His name was Mr. Caldwell. He was older than I expected, wore a rumpled blazer, and spoke with the soft, unhurried tone of someone who had watched many families come undone in his small office. He didn't talk down to me. He listened, truly listened, and when I showed him the documents, his expression changed in that subtle way people's eyes shift when they realize you are not to be dismissed. "You still have time," he said. That was all I needed. I had the house taken off the market the next day, called the agent myself. She sounded surprised, even apologetic, and said she'd been told everything was settled. I didn't explain. I didn't owe one. When Sarah came by the following weekend to start transitioning me her word, not mine, I met her at the door. I didn't invite her in. I stood on the porch, hands folded in front of me, and told her plainly that the house was no longer for sale, that there would be no move. Her face flushed, lips tightening around the words she couldn't quite form. She asked what I meant. I told her I had spoken to a lawyer, that David's authority was invalid, that I was staying. There was a long pause. Then she asked, "Why are you being like this?" I didn't answer. I simply turned and went back inside, leaving her on the porch like a solicitor. From that point on, the calls came differently. Tighter, less warm. David accused me of overreacting. Sarah sent me long, guilt-laced messages about wanting what's best. I didn't engage. I responded only when necessary, and even then, with the kind of brevity that people can't twist. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was trying to protect what little remained of me. I didn't host Easter that year. I didn't send birthday cards. I let the calendar drift past the old family traditions like a train that no longer stopped at this station. I wasn't angry, I was simply absent. They noticed. They didn't say it, but I could feel it, the shifting tone in their voices when we did speak, the way they tried, awkwardly, to check in. But I kept the distance. I had to. I'd learned the cost of filling every silence with giving, with sacrifice, with trying to make them comfortable at my expense. Instead, I filled my own silence with something else presence. I read again, I baked for myself, I planted new flowers, ones I'd never tried before. I started keeping a journal. Not for anyone else to read, but just to remember what it felt like to belong to myself again. On Christmas Eve, I stood in my own kitchen, my hands still sticky with the glaze I'd made from brown sugar and clove, staring at the grease-stained bags of Takeout on my dining table. The ham was resting on the counter, roasted to a perfect pink center, the potatoes whipped with heavy cream and butter, the green beans blanched just so, tossed with toasted almonds. My hands were trembling not with rage, but with something quieter, colder. They walked in carrying the bags like I hadn't been standing there all day, apron tied. The whole house filled with the warmth of cooking. No one said a word about the smell of cinnamon or the fresh rosemary I'd tucked into the rolls. Instead, they opened boxes of noodles and wings, sat down, and started eating. My son mumbled something like we weren't sure if you'd be up for a big meal without. Looking up from his phone, my granddaughter asked if I had any soy sauce. I didn't say a word. I walked back to the kitchen, took the ham out of the roasting pan, and dropped it into the bin, one by one. The dishes followed. I scraped the mashed potatoes into the garbage, the rolls, the cranberry chutney, everything. I wiped the counter. Slowly with a damp cloth, the steam from the now empty roasting tray fogging up my glasses. That was the night I knew. I'm Elaine Mercer. I'm 71 years old. And that was the moment I realized I was no longer a person in their eyes, just a placeholder, a background figure, the woman who used to matter. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks, I hadn't wanted much. Just one last dinner where I felt seen. I'd spent 3 days preparing that meal, rising early to get the pies baked before the kitchen warmed up. Washing the old china that I hadn't used since Robert passed. It had been years since I cooked that much, but something in me needed it, needed to feel useful, needed to pour myself into something that might gather everyone together again. Even just for one meal, I told them I was cooking, and made it clear. But somewhere between my words and their lives, I was filtered out like background noise. What hurt most wasn't that they brought takeout, it was that they didn't even notice. Not the smell, not the heat in the kitchen, not the effort. I might as well have been invisible. They didn't see the small folded recipe cards I'd pulled from the tin. The ones written in my mother's slanted hand. They didn't hear the music I put on those soft Bing Crosby records we used to play when Robert was alive and the kids were small, skating around the house in socks, begging for peppermint bark. No one noticed the fresh linen I laid on the table or the mismatched candles I arranged down the center, or the old silverware I'd polished the night before until my fingers cramped. The food they brought wasn't even warm. They unwrapped it like presents meant only for them, soggy fries and orange chicken in crumpled white cartons. No one offered me any. I wasn't hungry, though. Something in me had folded inward, neatly and finally, like the napkins I'd ironed that morning. I didn't cry. That part of me had learned to stay still long ago. Instead, I went to bed early, claiming their headache. I lay in the dark, listening to them laugh downstairs over some movie I didn't recognize. The sound of their voices felt far away, like waves breaking on a shore I no longer lived near. I turned to face the wall and let the quiet take me. The next morning, the trash bin was still full. The ham lying like a forgotten offering beneath banana peels and paper napkins. No one said a word about it. My granddaughter asked if we had cereal. My son said something about a new client. My daughter-in-law scrolled her phone, her face lit blue. I just nodded and stepped outside. The snow was fresh and heavy, but I didn't feel the cold. I stood in my robe on the back step, my breath rising in clouds, and looked up at the grey sky. I'd spent my whole life feeding people, and somehow I had ended up starved. I used to think that love was shone through baking, folding laundry just the way they liked it, remembering every birthday, anticipating needs before they were spoken. That if I loved hard enough, they would always come back to the table. But now I know people don't always recognize what love looks like until it's gone. And sometimes not even then. That Christmas, I became a ghost in my own house. The next day, I washed the dishes they used, took down the lights, and packed the china back into its boxes. I sealed them with care and placed them in the garage. Beside Robert's old toolbox, I didn't mention it to anyone. They never asked. They had no idea what they had lost. Not yet. They think I am quiet because I am old. They think I forget. But I remember everything, every flavor, every moment, every silence. And on that night, I stopped trying to be remembered. I used to believe motherhood meant being the one who held the seams of everyone else's life. Together, I didn't expect applause for it, but I thought there'd be memory, recognition, at the very least. Some small echo of all the years I poured myself into their days, like sugar stirred into tea, dissolving, invisible, but present, when I was younger, 32. Maybe I could hold a crying baby in one arm, stir stew with the other, and keep an eye on a pot of boiling bottles without once looking frazzled. That was when we still lived in the little blue house on Meadow Lane, where the backyard had a wooden swing that Robert built. Our son, David, used to run barefoot through the grass until his feet turned green. Sarah, our daughter, insisted on wearing her Sunday dresses to play in the dirt. I didn't stop her. I was the kind of mother who let things get messy if it meant memories would stick. Back then, money was tight. Robert worked for the rail line, sometimes gone for 2 weeks at a stretch. I babysat other children during the day, brought in what I could with mending and alterations, and clipped coupons with a kind of quiet precision. Every dollar was stretched into something: school shoes, dinner, a little chocolate on a Friday night. Still, I don't remember feeling poor. I remember the sound of David's laughter through the screen door and the way Sarah would bring me wildflowers she'd crushed in her tiny fists. The sacrifices began early, but they were never framed that way in my mind. That's just what you did. That's what being a mother meant. I went without new clothes for years. Wore the same wool coat through 3 winters while saving for David's braces. I took on extra sewing when Sarah needed piano lessons, even though we didn't have a real piano, just a keyboard that Robert found second-hand and repaired in the garage. I was always the one who remembered birthdays, allergy medications, school registration deadlines, the exact way Robert liked his shirts folded. I once drove through a blizzard to bring Sarah her retainer after she left it at home before a music recital. I sat in the back of the auditorium, dripping snowmelt onto the floor, and when she looked up and saw me, she gave me this little wave. Just a flick of the fingers. That was enough. There were late nights in hospitals too, when David broke his arm falling off the monkey bars. When Sarah had that appendix scar, I never left, not once. I knew the smell of every waiting room in town, knew which vending machines had decent coffee, which nurses were kind, and which doctors brushed off mothers who asked too many questions. I was the one who kept birthdays going even after Robert died. I learned to bake cakes for 1 instead of 5. I set the table anyway. I sang even when my voice caught in my throat. I made it joyful for them even when I was quietly falling apart. And holidays, I never missed one. Even when they started missing them, I used to make these tiny butter cookies in the shape of bells and holly leaves, glazed in green and red. David used to sneak them when he thought I wasn't looking. After Sarah moved out, she would still ask for a tin of them in the mail. I sent them every year without fail. Even the time I had the flu and my hands ached from fever, I made them. Anyway, it's strange, the little things that stay with you. I remember once, when David was 11, he got into a fight at school. They called me to come get him. He had a bloody nose and wouldn't speak, just looked down at the floor. That night, I made his favorite meatloaf and mashed potatoes. He didn't eat much, but after dinner, he came and sat beside me on the couch, didn't say anything, just leaned his head on my shoulder like he used to when he was small, and I remember thinking, this is it, this is what all the dishes and laundry and sleepless nights are for, this closeness. But time changes people, and distance grows without anyone noticing until it's a chasm. As they got older, they needed me less, but I didn't stop needing them. I tried not to show it. I kept calling, checking in, and sending cards, always remembering. Even when the thank yous came less often, even when the visits were hurried, and the phone calls were shorter, When David's wife was sick during her second pregnancy, I drove over every afternoon for 2 months, bringing soup and helping with their firstborn. Even though my knees were already giving me trouble, I rocked that baby to sleep so often that my arms forgot how to be still. When Sarah went through her divorce, she moved back in for almost a year. I gave her my room, let her take the master bed while I slept on the old couch in the den. She never said it outright. But I knew she thought she'd be judged if anyone knew she was back with her mother at 36. I covered for them, always. In front of their friends, their in-laws, even themselves. I played the background. I told myself that was what mothers did, that if I just gave more patience, more time, more understanding, they'd come around.